I think just follow on from Libby and maybe discuss some of the other projects. So we had 3 projects that I was talking about, and the other one was looking at localization, specifically looking at what barriers it are to for INGOs to develop a more localized approach. And the other one was looking at the RSE program, so looking at labour mobility and looking at focusing on kind of gaps and potential issues with the current policy settings, just because the RSE program hasn't really been reviewed since it first began. And so in terms of the reflections from the class, so before the panel I kind of asked for reflections, and so kind of sharing some of the kind of thoughts and comments from some of the other students that we had in our class. And one of the big ones was kind of understanding the scope and kind of narrowing down a really feasible topic within these really large areas of development. So one group had localization, that is obviously a really big Pandora's box, and particularly they weren't development students, so they had to really grapple with the literature. They had to grapple obviously with the key debates, what the current status quo is and potentially what the future vision should be. And so what was really difficult was kind of narrowing down something that's really feasible and doable, both from a methodological perspective, but also within the time constraints of a semester. And one of the big issues is obviously relationship building is really important to research, particularly with an external collaborator or stakeholders as well. Obviously that researcher-participant relationship has a lot of ethical considerations, and squeezed into a semester it often does bring some kind of power asymmetries potentially. So that was something that I think also the RSE group found as well, because that's a huge program. It's essentially MB's job to sort of, run that program, but doing these really large policy reviews and this research is something that, is constrained by time. So that is a key learning, I think, from a lot of us, is that kind of front end of doing this research is really important to be able to do something that's feasible, but also can be applied in practice. And so that engages questions around this kind of theory-practice gap, which is quite new for a lot of for students if we've never worked in the development sector before. The other, something I think that was also quite like a big learning for us as well, was sort of looking at the different scales at which development happens. So even though we are doing research with local partner organisations, there's still the macro and the meso level. So there's looking at development in the Pacific and the kind of wider sort of development sector generally. So that was something quite interesting when we were drafting recommendations and making this policy brief, is how do we write recommendations at these different levels, and there's a more kind of practical level, what can you do in the business as usual day to day, but then what can you do at this very strategic level that is actually probably engaging longer term questions around certain practices like localization, e-volunteering. So that was quite interesting, because probably as students we often sort of very focused on sort of getting things done in the now, but being able to think strategically I think is a really helpful skill, particularly when we go into the workplace where there's a policy briefing, but that's tied to a wider program of work or strategic sort of vision, I guess, for the partner organisations. And maybe just a final reflection, if I may, is I think student researchers occupy quite a unique space in this regard, because often if you are working for a government department, you obviously, there's certain things you have to do within the ambit of your department, and maybe you're not seen to be as maybe independent as somebody who's coming on to do the research. So obviously we're not consultants, so it's a very different relationship that the researchers as students have with stakeholders and partner organisations. And that's really good on one hand, because I think it gives us a lot more space and mandate to be more free and frank with the issues with the status quo, and you don't have to maybe think as much about the limitations of the practicalities, which is a really luxurious space to be in, because when you move into work, you do have to think about those practical constraints. But so for example, the RSE group, they had a bunch of recommendations that they wrote, and a lot of that is really aspirational, and that's something maybe like a consultant or someone who's a bit more closer to the work or has more vested interest by not being able to say, they maybe can't be as overly critical, or they have to be really temperate in their recommendations because they understand like MB doesn't have like $2 million to implement like a new part of the RSC program. So that can be quite interesting because if there's luckily there wasn't, I don't think there was too much conflict in the relationship, but what happens if then, there's different opinions between students or development organisations and the stakeholders themselves that are being interviewed. So that's an interesting kind of relationship potentially there. It luckily didn't happen for our class, but certainly it is something to consider is actually what is the role of the student researcher working with development partner organisations in implementing policy. Cool, that's me. Thank you. Sorry.
Shall we move on, Brenda, Laura, do you want to tell us a little bit about the project and how it went and the sort of learnings, etc., that come from that, your experience of undertaking this process?
Sure. So I'm Brenda Dyer, and I've just completed my Masters at University of Auckland, and just recently, about 3 weeks ago, I started in the programs team at Child Fund New Zealand, so I'm now officially a practitioner. Andreas, do you want to do a bit of an introduction of the program from the university side, or do you want me to do that?
I'm happy for you to do it, but is there anything particular that you want me to, like the history of how it...
Yeah, how it came about, kind of.
Well, so I'm Andreas Nee from the Development Studies program in University of Auckland, and I think in February or March, Tama contacted me and said, well, we still can't go to the city, we have the Uniworld program, but what about, because the Uniworld program is paused, we can do some e-volunteering activities, and we want to engage more with universities in general, and everyone who knows Tama, she's such an energetic, relentlessly positive and person, and you get just caught by her. Charming, offensive. And yeah, I said, great, bring on all the ideas that you have, and then she contacted UN Women and UN Women Priya, and her team said, yeah, we have this project, Markets for Change, and it would be, we have lots of data, we have lots of reports, all is unpublished, it's lying there somewhere on files and in shelves. We need someone to bring this all together. And I said, I have a great team of development studies students that probably would love to do this kind of project. And so I asked Laura, Brenda, and 4 other students whether they want to get involved, and they were really, immediately very much drawn into this space. I said you can use the data and the reports possibly to do a dissertation out of that, and 3 of the 6 students considered that and finally ended up using it for the dissertation. And 3 others did it on top of everything else. So that's a bit of an interesting. So Laura still doing something else. So it's a bit of an extra burden, but it also an interesting learning experience. While Brenda was one of those that used the data and the reports for her own critical dissertation. And I think the interesting thing is then also to learn from your experience, how do you kind of reconcile this more critical perspective that is needed for dissertation with doing a report for UN Women, which certainly shouldn't put the organization at risk or in some bad light. So that's something we made clear in our conversations, that this is something to think about, that the report should be on behalf of UN Women and not some external critique. So I think that's from my side.
Yeah, thanks. So as Andreas said, Laura and I with 4 others were doing some work for UN Women, and Priya was our kind of primary contact along with the M&E lead for UN Women in ESA. And so what they wanted was Markets for Change, which I'm sure Priya will give you a better introduction to, is a women's economic empowerment project that has been running in several countries in the Pacific. And the phase 1 of the project has been completed, and what UN Women wanted was a kind of a review of the project to look at the successes, what benefits have been achieved through the project, and so that they could have something to present externally, potentially to donors for phase 2 of the project. But then they also wanted us to look at the challenges that have been faced by the project, lessons learned, ways to improve implementation for phase 2. And so that section is going to be kind of an internal document for UN Women, so that they can try to make some improvements for the phase 2 of the project, which is supposed to be kicking off kind of now, next year. So I was one of the students that incorporated this project into my dissertation, and I'm really, really glad that I did, because it was much more time efficient. I've got 3 kids, and so I was all about efficiency. But it was also a really, really interesting topic to do for my dissertation. And the way that it was set up was we had regular kind of Zoom Teams meetings with mostly with Elisa and Zuba. And so it started off with him providing us with all the raw data and all of the project reports, the initial planning documents, and all the survey data that they had. There was an annual survey that was done of project participants throughout the project, and so we received all that data, and then we kind of finalised the project scope with Priya and in conjunction with other people from BSA to kind of narrow down the scope of what they really wanted and what was going to be useful for them and what was achievable for us in the time frame. So for the dissertation students, we've had all year to kind of decide and work on our dissertation, but there was a bit of a kind of a process in getting all the agreements set up between UN Women and University of Auckland and DSA, and all of those organisations have their own bureaucracy, and so getting it finally finalised, I think, was maybe August around then. So there was a bit of a delay in us getting the information and being able to start work on it. But that's kind of teething issues of a program like this when it's new and it's kind of a pilot project. So that would be something to kind of think about for the next time. But from my perspective, I absolutely loved having a real project to work on for my dissertation. I am all about the practical side. As part of my masters, I wanted to. That's why I did a talk masters, because I wanted to learn from Andreas and Jessie, and I wanted to, really get the teaching of how to be a practitioner. And so it was just really, really fantastic to have this real project to work on, and really feel like my research was actually going to have an impact and not just doing research for research's sake. So that was really important to me, and a real benefit of doing this. And also, it looked great on my CV. So that was an added bonus. So when I wasn't actually planning on applying for a job before I finished my masters, but that just presented itself, and being able to talk about this experience of volunteering through BSA with the UN Women was I think a really positive thing to have on my CV. And an added bonus for me as part of this project was that I just happened to be going on holiday with my family to Fiji in September, and so I was able to actually go to Suva and meet Priya in person and Elisa and some of the other team and have a discussion with them in person, and I felt that that made a huge difference. There's, that you just can't beat having face-to-face interaction, and I got a lot out of those few meetings that we were able to have, and so if possible, I think that that is something that could be incorporated into future programs, being able to actually go wherever you're doing. I mean, for you guys it was a bit different because you're already based in, your project is based in New Zealand, but to be able to incorporate, actual physical visits to wherever the project site is that you're doing. And Andreas, I know you used to do a kind of an overseas aspect to the development studies program, and now that COVID's over, maybe that can be brought back and kind of incorporated into this part of it. So that I felt was very beneficial for me. And yeah, that's about all I've got to say for the moment.
Fantastic. Laura.
So I'm Laura. Hi. I'm a current master's student at the University of Auckland doing my master's in international development. So I will accept prayers and thoughts as I write my thesis. And the other people who work with us do send their apologies. They're actually presenting their masters next door, so they might pop in if they get a chance. But yeah, I wanted to say hello. So from my perspective, I did not choose to incorporate the project as part of my thesis work. So I was doing this on top of doing my study and my research, as well as working part-time as well, which I think is an element that's not always discussed. Is obviously as students you've got to support yourself, and while you're still living off ramen noodles and such, it's nice to to be able to function in society with a bit of money. So it's a bit of a juggling act, and I found that's probably one of the most challenging aspects of the e-volunteering experience for myself was how do I find the time to work and to do my own research, which I'm so passionate about, but then also do this project, which is just so invaluable from a practical perspective. And I think that's one of the strengths of the project, is that we wanted to do it so badly because it let us take all the concepts and theories that we had done in class and apply them in a real world scenario, and really kind of experience what it's like to take that into the real world. A lot of us have never worked in any kind of career before. We're all very young. So having that first step, having that first step into the workforce and being able to bounce ideas off people who have worked for a long time, and obviously Priya and her team have been fantastic in that regard, and getting to understand how to operate as development practitioners when we're just starting out, working out all the kinks that you have with your first proper adult job, working out how to act, how to behave, what you need what deadlines you need to work towards, and just how to function in that role, which was such an amazing practical experience. But also getting to see a real project in action and understanding how that actually impacts the lives of the people that you're reading about in these surveys, and really putting kind of faces to the work that you learn about in class. It's one thing to read it off, a textbook, to hear about different projects and examples, but it's another thing to actually get to talk to people running the project, get to hear the stories of the women and the people in these marketplaces. So it's been a fantastic opportunity from that perspective as well. I'm trying to think of anything else that I really to say. Brenda covered quite a lot. Sorry. I think also what was very valuable for me was in evaluating my own thesis work, having kind of, I wouldn't say officially worked, but having somewhat worked in Fiji and met Priya and her team, and also got a feel for a little bit of the culture and understanding how development operates in that space. I actually chose to include Fiji as part of a case study that I'm working on within my thesis, so that was also really valuable to kind of understand having someone, as someone who's never worked practically in the space, to be able to get some sort of experience to understand how I could then take that into my thesis and my research work has been, been fantastic. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for all your reflections. My little subheading here is achievements and challenges. So I want to talk about sort of what was valuable in this experience, both in terms of data collection, but also pedagogical kind of aspects. Think about, we've already heard some of the challenges that was faced, but to get this started, it'd be nice to bring in Danella and Priya. Maybe if I could start with you. Danella, you obviously, for those who don't know, Danella has come from an academic background and has moved into working with VSA, so I imagine that you've got can look at this issue from a whole bunch of different aspects.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity. So up until end of June this year, I was an academic and had been for 11 years at University of Waikato, Centre of Global Studies and Education, and absolutely thrilled to come to VSA, but also incredibly sad to leave my postgraduate students. So I was so thrilled when Tamar cornered me a few weeks into my new role and said, hey, would you be interested in liaising, working with some students? And I was just rapt because I couldn't have wished for anything more coming into this role. So I look at this from a academic pedagogical perspective as well as from a VSA organisational perspective as well, and I just think across the board it has been so positive. It has been such a wonderful, enriching experience for us as an organisation, and for a number of reasons. So first of all, Libby, Kyrie and Rowan were just phenomenal as students, and I'm really pleased, Rowan, you talked about your positionality as a student researcher, because what I was really impressed with right from the get-go was the way that all of them really worked to establish a really positive relationship with us, and also were really mindful in their position, knowing that they were researching as an outsider, but also aware that their perspective and their research was important, and it absolutely is, and just be really careful but also practical in the way that they engaged with us. So I really commend them for that, because it's not an easy pathway to navigate sometimes, and I just thought that they were really thoughtful in the way that they engaged with us. From an organisation perspective, I think these partnerships are just so wonderful. Having the opportunity to have research and to explore an area and a piece of work which at a deep level, within the time that they had, was just fantastic. E-volunteering is something that we have as VSA, obviously through COVID pandemic, has been part of our programs, and we've had reviews, etc. over the last few years, but an opportunity to have research that's looked at the perspective of e-volunteers was just wonderful and really, really timely for us. So it was, for a start, it was a great piece of work that we could learn from, and that was a key thing. And I think that the research, I encouraged them to come present to us, which they did a couple of weeks ago, and the learnings and the recommendations that they shared were really, really, really important for us. And I was just saying to Rowan before that even since 2 weeks ago, I've had staff come up and say, I'm still thinking about that presentation, and gosh, they raised this point, it was really, really, really interesting, and I've been thinking about that, and I've been wondering about how we might be able to X, Y, and Z. And so, this is you've all talked about theory to practice, and I know as an academic as research, you write research and publish and you think, gosh, does anyone actually read it? And it's just so wonderful when you've got this real audience and people genuinely taking off all these recommendations, because they were so thoughtful and well considered, and we can learn from that. And when we think about it from a learning experience and a collaborative learning experience, it is so powerful. So, I could rave about the process and experience for ages, but I think it's been such a valuable opportunity for us as an organisation, and for us to continue to learn collectively. And we don't often, as an organisation, have the time necessarily to engage in deep dive research, literature reviews into aspects of our work. And so the opportunity for the team to kind of share aspects of that with us through the report and through their presentation was really important as well. So really, we appreciate that.
Very well. Brown. External stakeholder engaging with their students. It'd be great to hear how you think it went and the kind of the good things and challenges from your side of things.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the opportunity for me to be a part of this DevNet conference. It's really something we're looking forward to from UN Women. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank BSA, Thomas specifically. She has been actually the mover and the shaker to make this happen together with Andres. Thank you so much. And we as UN Women, we really value this partnership, and I think with this new arrangement and engagement, we have really progressed from just having BSA volunteers in office, building capacity of office staff, and having this e-volunteering aspect added to it really worked in our favor. So I just wanted to give a very brief intro of the Markets for Change project so that you have a better understanding of the huge volume of work that the students have actually put in such a short time. Markets for Change project actually started in the year 2014, so phase 1 concluded in 2021. So that's 8 years of information and data that this brilliant and very enthusiastic team took upon themselves to really turn it around into reports and research work. So 8 years of data, and we did biannual surveys, plus we had donor reports, we had our UN Women reports, we had surveys done, we had rapid surveys, a mix of everything, including post natural disasters in the Pacific, also COVID as well. So there was just so much data and information, and we were just overwhelmed with project implementation as well. So it was all just kept there, and we were always thinking in the back of our minds, how are we going to use this? We've done so much work as a project, but it's all lying there. We have donor reports, etc., but how do we really develop and bring reports? And also, I think with this arrangement here, it worked more like an independent audit exercise as well for us, because as colleagues have just mentioned, having a short-term consultant is what we would traditionally engage with to have such research and work done. But having e-volunteers do that was like a fresh perspective, independent approach. That basically to us is something very useful as well, because as Brenda has mentioned, we have two sets of report. One that would be external, and the other that is internal to UN Women, which will really bring out the nuts and bolts of what really didn't work as a project for us. So that is something that we will use to actually improve the design of phase 2. We have already started phase 2, but that will really help us with improving the design, looking at the challenges. And what really for us was the value add is having a fresh perspective to all the reports and everything. Usually we write reports, we do data collection. It's all in the interest of what we'd like to see, what we want the donors to see as well. Having this approach, I think, really is like having an audit done of the work that we are doing. And whilst we do plan to have the external pieces out there for turning them into further knowledge products, using it for resource mobilization, more advocacy of the work that we do, this internal pieces would really help us strengthen the project as well. So that is something that we feel is really important for us, and will help us guide better with phase 2. So it's a very important aspect of the work that we anticipate to have on in our hands as well. Having said that, this was a very new arrangement and engagement. COVID has taught us so many things, and I think this e-volunteering came at a very opportune time for us as well. And I feel like, we've had discussions as a project team as well internally. This has really worked in favor of the work that we'd like to do, in future as well. Whilst it was like virtual, we also felt that it was really talking to the needs that we had as well. And in terms of timeliness, usually if we have like short-term consultants, everything is so fast, and they have a timeline to complete things. They're always engaged in other projects or other assignments as well. So that kind of takes away the essence of some of this work that we'd like short-term consultants to do. However, having the students to e-volunteer to do this, we also felt like we had the time on hand as well to really engage and provide that information and that intervention as well. And I think we did well in terms of looking at the busy schedules of the team as well, in terms of not only studies, but, part-time job, etc. as well. So we had some teething problems in the beginning in terms of when we could connect, but it was very easily resolved. If we couldn't meet as a team due to other commitments, we would have bilateral meetings just to catch up. So I think having this e-volunteering, service is really something that worked, I think, for both parties, and it was like a win-win situation. There were times when, they'd like to get in touch with us, but we would be out on missions, etc. So it was really difficult as well. So we kind of planned around it, and we managed to work around those challenges as well. Some of the other things that we also felt was with the students being so excited and enthusiastic about all the data and information, they had so much feedback and so many things, which really we are so bogged down with just project implementation, we usually forget about these things. So, when we had questions about, so why did this not work? Or why are you choosing this? Or what happened with this data? So that also, gave us the opportunity to really think about some of the things that we don't do on a daily basis and really get back and say, okay, so sometimes after our Zoom meetings, we would sit down as a team and say, we really need to work on that. So it was really helpful for us as well to use that opportunity to think of it as an opportunity to improve the way we do things, also pick up on things that may have just fallen through the cracks. So for us, I feel all in all, this has been a great opportunity. And like I said, I would always tend towards having this arrangement rather than having a short-term consultant come in and do something. This was a real eye-opener for us as well, in terms of seeing the difference. Usually, consultants are really time. They are very concerned about time. They do not have the luxury of time, and then there's lots of back and forth as well. And sometimes they also just do not have the product the way we'd like to see it, or what our thinking was is very different to what has been produced or developed. However, with this, I think the interaction, the liaison, the communication has been much more effective. Yeah, and I think overall, everyone has said kind of what I wanted to say, so my points here, I was like, okay, check. That usually happens with the last person to speak, so the majority of things have been said. Yeah, but all in all, I think moving forward as well from this experience, we are looking at strengthening our partnership with BSA and the University of Auckland as well. And I think we've already had some talks this week. So, yeah, and I think one more thing in terms of the importance of having that connection, like at least having 1 or 2 visitations, you know, while doing this, coming in country and visiting the stakeholders and the beneficiaries really is important as well, and we felt that as well in terms of, you know, having that connection with the beneficiaries. It gives you a very different perspective. Like I know with the reports and, you know, the interaction with the team, it's there. But just going out to the markets and meeting those women, you know, it makes all that difference as well in terms of having a better understanding. So I would also encourage that in future. Like, you know, this e-volunteering, perfect. But, you know, if we could have a few visitations as well, that would really work, I think. And also we'd like, it would be nice for the beneficiaries, like the women vendors, to also meet and see people who are writing, you know, reports and writing about them and what they have done and all these things. So it will really be useful in that sense as well, because they love the opportunity of meeting, like, you know, high-profile visitations of ambassadors and ministers, etc. But you would be surprised when, you know, consultants or other people that we engage with go to the market. It just gives them that feeling of importance. Oh, I'm so important, they're writing about me. So, you know, that also connects. And when we meet, we do meet with them twice in a year. They, you know, when they do their presentations, they usually bring up things like this. Oh, when this person came to the market, this is what we were able to discuss. This is what we were able to show them. So I think that also makes a big difference, that human interaction. No, thank you. Yeah.
I think, Doug, could I chime in there a little bit? I think it's interesting what you're saying about the whole face-to-face interaction, because I was, Rohan and I were looking at each other before, because it's funny, and that's pretty much exactly what came up from our research into e-volunteering, is how, you know, that it's really difficult navigating that sort of digital kind of, you know, trying to do work on the ground, but especially if you're coming from a different context, if you've never been to this country before and you're trying to conduct these projects that maybe aren't always meant to be online, you know, so it's interesting. That face-to-face is so important. So one of our recommendations was, you know, if possible in the future, I mean, obviously with COVID, you know, we all had to be constructed in a short amount of time and things, but we did recommend that like a hybrid arrangement would be a good idea. So maybe you start with a stint in whichever country you're working with, and then you get that context and that initial learning, I guess, and connection, and then you can go home and you've got that, you know, relationship already, and maybe it'll make your work more effective. I think also it was interesting, Laura, you're saying in terms of timing. I feel like I'm speaking for both of us. It's definitely, we've also found it's been really difficult to juggle for us, like, I guess, as student researchers, you know, with our other, so we did, this was part of our compulsory paper, and then we had 2 other papers in our dissertations to do just that semester, so it's quite a lot to sort of, I guess I often felt like I wanted to make sure I was doing it justice, you know, and sort of being like a real consultant, but still having to, you know, do all these other papers and things as well. So I think it's definitely a widespread sort of a thing. And also from our e-volunteering research as well, we did find even our participants said with their own e-volunteering projects, time was a massive thing for them, being able to balance, you know, their projects with their home lives. You know, they've got family there, they've got work to do, you know, so it does add that, I guess, layer of complexity than if you're in country, which I wouldn't have expected, but there you go.
Just to jump off what Priya was saying about how, you know, us asking 1,000,001 questions about things that potentially could have fallen by the wayside. Obviously, as students, we come in all shiny and new with exactly how things are supposed to go. And of course, we haven't quite yet been tempered by how it actually happens. But having that perspective where, you know, we've just learned what's best practice and what's up to date in terms of what, you know, practical, how things should go. I guess it kind of does bring back that, oh yeah, maybe we should be thinking about that again, you know, and just kind of bringing in that what we had as expectations of how development should work, kind of brings that back in, I think, and brings that back to people who have been doing it for a long time, and kind of gives them that old perspective of, oh yeah, you know, maybe we should be doing this, and what was our survey methodology and all that kind of stuff, and make the kind of rethink what I guess you kind of just do on an autopilot when you've been practicing for a long time.
Should we turn our attention to the audience now? You've heard from all of our fabulous panellists. They've given me lots to think about, so I'm going to break from my script a little bit here and ask if anybody's got any initial thoughts or reflections on how this process has gone.
I'll start. Yeah, first I just want to congratulate you all for this. Tamara, I find this really magic, and to think, the university for picking it up, because on my profile, I said I've been 3 times volunteer, and I came through volunteer experience which led me to where to today. And just hearing what you're saying was exactly the scenario that I went through, and came back to VSA with it, and sadly it just died, and I had to be on my own. So I was appointed for policy for Polytech, and it's a very so being a Pacific Islander, it worked for me, and it didn't work for me, because arriving in there, they were expecting the office manners of a European. But the work that was given to me, I was very happy with, because I could see I could be of a lot of use, which is the part that I would have probably have done it e-volunteering, because I had to write, to fill in what recommendations they were given to do. And I was quite happy with that, but it also threatened some people. So, and being a Tonga going to another island, I had a bit of a friction at the workplace, which could have been removed if I was e-volunteering. And finished the work and was appreciated by the next group, the next. So there was high turnover. So the next appointees were really appreciating the work, which was really good from our volunteer VSA's perspective. But then outside, I was like a Tongan to these people, because we were Polynesians, and they asked me to do to write a proposal for them, because they were a bit weary of the consultants and their fees and what they have to go through. So I had to really learn this new area of waste management, or whatever the development areas. I was reading quite a lot about that. Got to their proposal pass on the concept stage, and I was trying to ask VSA if they could see the value on that, to pick that, because after the new knowledge I had from this development work, I felt like I needed to go through a PhD program just to, make sure that the project was pushed to completion, and also that to just gain some new knowledge. So from that point, I was alone, and luckily there was a professor in Messi who was keen to take that on. So that's why I'm here today, and I'm so very happy to hear what you shared and how it's working, because you would understand from the ground what we need in the islands, and the contributions from academia that they bring into the. So I just want to say to you, and so it's magic for me to hear this and the work that you have started, and I know it will progress, because hearing the minister this morning. Okay, that's my one piece. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I think it's really interesting. My name is Smriti Talwar. I'm a social scientist. I work with GNS Science, and I'm also sort of someone who also keeps trying to sort of find this balance between navigating between doing practical work that's applying knowledge, trying to sort of stay abreast of what's happening in theory, but applying it as well. But I'm wondering what you all think of this challenge of not just connecting up practicality with with sort of, I guess, almost like theoretical best practices, but also sort of that third link to local realities, you know. And I'm wondering, you know, so much of our attention in research and analysis seems to be speaking to each other. You know, you're sort of working off surveys that have extracted some information, and then you're sort of analyzing those surveys, you're sort of doing some reports on those surveys. Effectively, you're sort of discussing someone who's no longer part of the conversation once you've extracted that information. Do you think it would be too complex in a program such as this to add that third dimension, to really sort of say, not only are you speaking to each other, meaning not just is the university speaking with BSA and UN Women, but there might be that third link as well to people.
Can I answer that? Yeah. So I think that is a conversation for the university ethics committee. Yes, that would be amazing. That would be the ultimate, I think, which is exactly what Priya was just saying, to be able to go and speak to the people. But as postgrad students, we are limited by what we can do in terms of what is authorised by the University Ethics Committee. So if you want to go and do face-to-face interviews with people or any kind of human participants, then you need to have that approval, and it's a very long, complicated process, as Andreas will attest to. And so unless you are actually doing a full master's thesis or a PhD, we're actively discouraged from doing that. And that, I think, is a huge obstacle. And if that could be overcome by a magic wand, then that would be amazing. I don't know what it's like down at Otago. Is that
the Otago projects did get ethical
they get
approval, but
people. So
it took a fair while to do that.
yeah.
I was actually impressed how quick it was, and I was thinking, gosh, you've got really quick survival. I know it can be.
I mean, it's partly because working with a stellar group there. So I would like to say that everybody who studies at Otago is as amazing as the students that you see in front of you, but that's not quite the case. It's certainly the case that together we try to get the ethics applications. Also, I guess to say is that in the case of Libby and some of the other students have already gone through the process of undertaking ethics approval in their undergraduate degrees at Otago. And so there was disparity within that group about the kind of experience that they were bringing to this process. So some of the students had already, from their undergraduate, their capstone paper, if they were geography students, they go and do face-to-face research with external stakeholders somewhere. They learn about research methods, and so they're sort of coming to this on the front foot. But one of the challenges of teaching this paper is that there was actually students from a whole bunch of different backgrounds, and some of them didn't have that kind of understanding. They didn't know how to do an ethics application. They didn't understand about the kind of research methods and methodology which might be involved in this kind of thing. So I'm not sure how to overcome this, but this was a really challenging situation for me, I have to say.
Can I just quickly to that point, sorry, my name is Rohan. I think I didn't say that when I started talking, so I just wanted to jump in. I'm also one of the Masters of International Development and Planning students with Libby, and I thank you for the question, because when we were reflecting on what we could do again differently, one of the things that we notice a lot in the literature is research comes from a specific kind of perspective, right? It's very heavy in terms of donor countries, for example, and the host organisation, local perspectives don't really come a lot through the research, and particularly for e-volunteering. I don't think we found any kind of research around what was the experience like for host organisations, the host e-volunteers, and what was that local experience like working with e-volunteers. Was it actually in some cases really bad because they had to spend a lot of time and resources to pivot and reorientate their support wraparound program, for example. I think that's a really big area, is maybe also having a lot more of a participatory methodology design process as well. So obviously that's a really big thing to consider as well when we want to be thinking about also not just what the research is, but the process of decolonising that perspective. So I think one of the things that, particularly for the RSE group, that they noted a lot is that there's like they are outsiders coming in and researching RSE workers, and that is a certain like perspective and worldview, and actually that's laden with a lot of like issues around like developing that kind of narrative and those binaries, and so I think the biggest constraint is time, obviously, and like the bureaucracy of institutions, but if there was more time and the ability to do it over maybe a longer term, it would be great to be able to involve the local stakeholders or host organisations in being in the design of the question and the collection and also the feedback loop. And and I think like if it had been more time, it would be great to like interview them as well. And I think that is kind of bringing that kind of third perspective in. And I think it is also helpful for students when they leave as well, because they've had the, I guess it's a lot more of an activist approach in a sense, like we're actually really deliberately trying to think about not just the content of what we're doing, but how we're doing it. And I guess, that's a really big, obviously, passing to Doug and Andres to kind of think about whether that's something that's useful for future kinds of, courses like this. But I think being able to think more deliberately about like the ethics of actually how we're conducting the research and who we're bringing in would be a really big opportunity.
I think also too, Rohan, you're saying that maybe like working on a longer time frame, or like how you guys were saying, like you incorporated your work with your dissertation, over the year. I think also that having that more time will sort of increase like the strength of your research and be able to, like, I know some of the problems we had a bit of sort of, like participant selection bias and things like that, and lack of sort of representativeness. So I think if we did have a bit more time, there would be like a lot of value in that, and to be able to include that sort of more third dimension, and maybe our work could go even further, So.
And I think from a student perspective, the thing about e-volunteering is that you're not going to potentially be able to get that local connection. That's the caveat to it. And for some students, like myself for example, as much as I would love to go and see everything and talk to people and do an in-person volunteering experience, which some of the other members of our team are actually doing next year once they graduate, I don't have the capacity or the time to do that, and also do my own research and also my home life and all that kind of thing. So the e-volunteering is kind of that, I guess, that in-between step where you can try to get as much local experience as you can, and potentially, moving forward, doing that like trip to go see would be a fantastic way to kind of mitigate that. But at the end of the day, I think with e-volunteering, you do know that at a certain point you can't get the full experience that you could get with an in-person volunteering placement. So.
Yeah, thanks. Well, firstly, great to hear about Ruahan and Libby landing so well. I got to hear about that conversation a bit earlier in the process, and it sounds like you guys did an amazing job, so well done. It's a great conversation. I want to speak to the people at each end. I'm interested in that. So what's being described is, on the one hand, something a bit like a student placement, a deep, well-resourced learning experience that's making the most for the students in their postgraduate studies. And at the other end, it's kind of like a consulting gig, filling a technical need for the organisations involved. And so you talked a bit about rather do this than do consulting, or bring a consultant in. But I wanted to scratch at that a little bit, because I think it's really interesting. The two things are, I see absolutely from a student perspective, you want a meaningful project, not an abstract project. You want to be able to talk to real people about a real thing and be able to see that your ideas and recommendations land somewhere and somebody listens to that. I also get the idea about wanting that to be bigger and well-resourced, to be able to connect with people, not just over Zoom or Teams, but interview people and get all of that. And I also get what you're saying about a richer, more gently paced experience. But I imagine there's also some other tensions around getting this work done that come. So you bring in a consultant, they're expensive, but they're also time-bound. They're time-bound, but they're time-bound. You only demand so much of your time. It only demands so much of your resources. If you move from the short-term consultant to this model, that involves a lot more of your team's time. If you're bringing 6 students over to interview people at the market, then there are all the resources associated with that, and the time, and the challenge of actually bringing a whole lot of people who aren't culturally immersed into that setting. So, I'm just interested in that tension between, from the organisational perspective, between what I see, what you celebrate about this model, but also about getting that right in terms of the objectivity and perhaps that, your obligations might be to the students more in this situation than to the research conceivably, or the rigour, I don't know. So just wanted to scratch a bit about that, particularly given what you said about, given the choice, you'd rather keep bringing the students back than bringing consultants.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And in terms of this arrangement, this was a pilot, so lots of learnings from this arrangement as well. And like I had shared earlier on that in terms of the data collection for the project, we do that twice a year. So I think if it comes to planning this together, that would work, because we don't have to go and do separate surveys. We could just incorporate those surveys and have the students come over, and like just sitting here and listening to all the discussions and conversations, just like we have this sessions, the e-sessions where we talk over Zoom, etc. We could also arrange similar meeting spaces with the market vendors, for example, for our project, where you don't have to come in country, all the time. But if we plan it better with the activities that we have for the year, you could become part of that survey team that goes out twice in a year. For example, in our case, that will not mean that we will be doing additional work. That's one. And the other one is in terms of having these e-sessions with the stakeholders, because we have provided the facilities, we have provided the equipment, the ICT equipment now, whereby during COVID, most of our trainings, etc., were done virtually. So that is something we could also use to interact with the stakeholders on the ground. And these facilities are at the market, so they don't have to leave their stalls, for example, and go to another place, etc. So it's quite convenient for them. So that is like one way I'm just thinking right now in terms of how we could engage better. Also, maybe something I forgot to mention is having a group of 6 students as opposed to having a consultant. For me personally, with the different focus I've seen them take in terms of the report writing, that wouldn't be possible with just having a person as a consultant doing that. The level of in-depth, I think, research that they have done in the focused areas, that would not be easily done by just one person being there. So I feel that added value of having students is really there in our case for Markets for Change, because we do understand how things have worked, and just looking at some of the reports and the modality of contracting and engaging consultants and the way this pilot took place, we have seen how, what are the benefits of having this in place rather than that. And what are some of the benefits of having a consultant as well instead of this arrangement? So, yeah.
Can I just clarify a little bit of what, so even though we've got 6 volunteers, we're not all doing the same thing. So we're, so Priya and her team chose 5 different themes that she wanted us to look at the project through these lenses. So I'm doing it through looking at the human rights-based approach. So my background is law, I'm aware. So I'm looking at it at the human rights of the vendors and the duties of the local municipal government. And then some of the other students are doing COVID-19 response, disaster risk reduction, and Laura, you were doing
Women in leadership.
Yep. So we're all looking at the same project but through different lenses, and so that you definitely would not get from a consultant.
No, just say something that I think Ali was saying.
I'll just add, because I think also you're sort of getting at maybe some of the tensions around, possible tensions, and I just have to say the team that I was working with were just amazing. Like, and I know they're so amazing postgraduate students, but I also am aware that, you know, and this was a thought before I'd even met them, I was like, well, I know that sometimes there are all sorts of things that happen in the lifespan of a student completing a project, sickness, all sorts of things that can impact on that, and that does have an impact on the partner organisations, you know, for us as well. And so in my mind I was thinking, okay, first of all there has to be that trust, and you know, we were talking about access to participants, and so I was quite interested in the ethical aspect of that, coming from my background, we sat on the ethics committee, but also, you know, as a point of being able to provide access to participants and for them to engage with that data in a way that was sensitive was really important for me to know that I had that trust with them. And I'm aware that, you know, potentially in the future there may be some students that perhaps maybe that trust might not be quite there yet, and so from a organisational perspective, that may mean that the project might need sort of different parameters around it, if that makes sense. So I guess, you know, the interesting thing is from our perspective, time as well. The time factor is tight, and, you know, we did have to work quickly in some cases to get things out and get things going, but I was also acutely aware of what it's like to be a supervisor, sitting in the background thinking, oh gosh, this is going to come off, so I understand that. But potentially for other organisations that may not be something they can move on quite so quickly. So yeah, there are lots of kind of moving factors in there, and then also I anticipate from a university perspective there could be times where, for example, in our organisation things pop up where we can't be as accessible, or for whatever reason things may not go, and I know the impact of that on students and completing work and projects, and the high costs and high stakes for that. So, you know, there are some definite and real tensions and challenges that could come through the process. You know, personally, our experience was great, but also recognise that in the future there will be challenges along the way, and it's something to consider. Yeah, plans A and B, I think.
That's certainly the case for the other two projects, the Otago and Cohort. Getting that sort of buy-in from external stakeholders and those which were kind of identified at the beginning wasn't as consistent, or as perhaps the level of investment of those stakeholders wasn't there to the same extent as VSA, and I think that was a really stressful thing for the students involved, because there's a lot on the line for them, and they're spending a lot of time trying to reach out to these groups, and, you know, kind of working, and people saying they're going to do things and they're not.
I feel that.
So you have another question, and then we'll go.
Hi, I'm Alan Youngbrat, and true confession, I'm a consultant. But I would just one plug before I jump into my question. I would encourage everybody to recognize that not all consultants are expensive stooges who just say what we think you want to hear. We do try to be passionate practitioners as well. But I work a lot in monitoring, evaluation, research and learning, and I work with a lot of programs, and, you know, you both could attest to this, that it's really critical that a program is gathering information from day one all the way through to the end. In order to make the decisions in this day and age, we have to understand what's going on in context. We have to, as you say, be participatory, involving stakeholders, looking at things from different dimensions in order to continually improve. Because if this was easy, you know, the world would be a better place already. So I think there's a real space here for longer-term partnerships. Now, students may not go all the way along, but, you know, longer-term partnerships between academia and projects, because there's always need. Projects are pressured. They're always looking at, well, you know, these are the indicators that we agreed with the donor, but then they think, well, heck, we're not looking at things from a human rights perspective. Well, we've just realized we're hearing inklings and some interesting things going on in terms of women's economic empowerment. We don't have the in-house capacity to explore that and to figure out how can we build on it. Or even things like, you know, we started, when we put together our monitoring results measurement plan, we thought surveys would be a great idea. We realized that's probably not the right methodology, but we don't have the expertise in how to do effective qualitative research. So I think there's a real space for that student what you have is you've just been going through, you've been learning about best practice, you've been looking at all these different angles, and that's something that projects often don't have time to do. And I could see some really exciting sort of longer term partnerships where, you know, a student would have unexperience on a topic, but over time that university might accompany that project for 5 or 10 years to be able to provide that supplementary support that is so critical with the adaptive management that projects have to have if they're going to make a difference.
I think interestingly that you say that, because one of the first deliverables that we kind of did for the project was the M&E consultant for UMM Fiji. He wanted some ideas on what to do for the next round of surveys. How can it be changed? How can it be made better? What falls in line with best practice now as opposed to when they started in 2014? So we really that was kind of our real first taste of a little bit of consulting, was to sit down and brainstorm, okay, well, what do we like about these surveys? What don't we like? What is appropriate? What is something that we know now from, having just studied this literally the semester before? What can we, how is it supposed to work, and how can it work in practicality? So that was one of the first things we did was actually that. So I can see you're absolutely right. There's certain space there for some really exciting work, I think, for students and also for the partner organisations.
Yeah, thank you for that. My name is Litia.
I'm sorry, there was a question here that has been
sorry.
lined up for you. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right, thank you so much. My name is Maggie, and I'm a PhD student at Lincoln University. I should recommend you, first of all, for accommodating students into your organization and giving them such an experience. It's a very beautiful thing to do. My question is actually on the flexibility of the data management and sharing. The students are coming in, they are working, they are contributing to writing reports for the organization and promoting the agenda of the organization. But at the same time, they also have some academic interests. They want to come out with publications and things like that. How flexible are you to also help them to get into publications using your data, or compelling that they have contributed somehow to the work that you're doing? Because I know sometimes it's also sensitive that as organizations, you also want to champion certain things and actually attach it to yourselves that we have done this and it's for external use or something like that. So how flexible is it that it becomes both a win-win situation for both the organization and the students, like you contribute to their academic career as well? I just want to understand the flexibility and if it's something you could look into.
That's for me. In terms of UN Women, we do have guidelines in terms of engagement of external partners and having students and writing up of papers, etc. So just using those agreed guidelines is something that we very clearly work alongside with. Apart from that, if there are any specific requests in terms of the students wanting to use the data, etc., they usually write to UN Women, and then it goes through our internal approval process right up to our headquarters at New York, and then based on our legal department and the guidelines that we have, then we are able to respond. So I think in terms of the current assignment, the guidelines were shared in terms of what can be done and cannot be done. So we're just sticking to that. I mean, in terms of UN Women, I feel that we are in a safe space when it comes to the guidelines, etc. However, we do feel that when there is input and so much effort from the students, there has to be some flexibility. But like I said, that decision is made through an internal approval process on a case-by-case basis.
And for the work that we're doing at the moment, for the students that are combining it with our dissertations, the dissertations for the masters and honours are not published, so we actually don't need to worry about that at this point, but I can understand that it's a good question for future.
Yeah. So I was going to say that for this particular project, it was not a published And actually I went back to both Libby and Roland because staff were really interested in the findings. I said, would you mind if we could execute some of the summary, because they really were genuinely interested. But to answer your question in terms of publication, and I absolutely understand from a doctoral research how critical that is to your own research, and your ethics process obviously would and as an organisation agreeing to be part of that would be an agreement to allow that data to be used for publication. And saying that, I guess it depends also on the scope and the research as well. I can think of some instances where it perhaps might need more careful thought in terms of parameters around it, and there'd be some instances where, probably fair to say, we would look quite carefully at how or what sort of information might be able to be disseminated in a particular way. But in the context of this particular process or project, it was fine. So yeah. But a really good question, and I think there is great scope for increased partnerships around publication in this space, and I think there's a real need from it as well. Absolutely. So.
Thank you. I was just going to add about the two models. From the perspective of a person in the island who need the help of development help, and from a person who reads the report, there is just that mechanic feeling about the report and the template type, and I might as well pick up the answer from a textbook or someone's written it before. From the organic experience that happens in this model, that is invaluable. So whether they marry or there's a hybrid, but there is still the value in the volunteer on the ground work. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, thanks for that. We've got ex-students doing all sorts of projects with development partners, and a particular question that's kind of pedantic academic one around the process that was raised earlier. That is, I've had students who have picked up data and used data collected by organisations and body surveys and all the sorts of things that you're talking about. And our ethics committee had pushed back a bit and said, well, what can you tell us about the consent process that went behind the collection of that data? How can we guarantee, and you as a researcher, or me as a supervisor, guarantee that there was an ethically informed consent process that sat behind the collection of the data that you are now using? And it seems, we seem to be sort of pushed backwards further and further, and I don't know if any of your projects have bumped up against that, or whether there is a way that we can kind of streamline some of these processes.
Seems like we have to go through the whole supply chain.
I don't know if that was something that any of the students came up against in your use of data that had already been collected by another organisation. Did you have to consider the ethical basis of what that data was doing?
Yeah, I think in our case we just did primary stuff, didn't we? We didn't. I'm trying to think we didn't. Did the other groups, incorporate any other data?
No, it was just all primary. Yeah.
No. Stuff that they generated themselves, and they had ethical approval.
Yeah, so we just did our own surveys and interviews and stuff, so it wasn't a problem for us.
I think our ethics committee makes it clear that if it's secondary data, then it's not under the University of Auckland Human Ethics Committee. So it's not an issue that they need to deal with. So that would be a big time. Don't say that too loud.
Turn up all recording.
Gives a new idea of make things more complicated.
Is that the line about around if that data is otherwise available? So if UN Women's surveys that they've collected over the course of 8 years in this study is otherwise available, then does that just short-circuit that need? Would it for Massey? If it was sure.
I mean, each one of those questions you don't want to ask.
No. You would think that if that's if I can just access that report. I can just spend 5 minutes and access that report. Then, but if it sits, so then have to be
sort of raises questions too about the ethical baggage that students versus consultants bring to.
That's right. Which comes back to my question, which is kind of exactly about. So, like, on the one hand, you want to do it, you see all the benefits, but it comes with, like, there needs to be appetite and bandwidth to engage in this long, difficult, potentially, process in order to get the rich rewards both for students and organisation. But implies a certain appetite. So this is almost like a positive deviance model here, like glowing example of everything working for everybody. But there's
what are you saying? It's not like that every time?
My mistake.
Philip, are you interested in contributing to this? Because you're a bit of an ethics guru when it comes to this crossover of this space between the practitioner and the development scholar kind of.
Yeah, I mean, well, secondary source material, you can always assume that, you just have to really assume that's accurate data and it's being gained ethically, unless you have reason to doubt that, and then of course you should, think about your use of it. I mean, in this instance, when we know it's good, it's good information, good data, they have good processes in place. If anyone's going to, I think you guys might. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it is always a good question around that source of where you've got a lot of that information, and as much as possible you should always try and verify it through your own processes, but depends on your time and availability and what else is going on as well.
And would a letter from the organisation be sufficient to give consent and access to, or you're sort of saying?
Yeah, that's kind of what the ethics about the nature of the way in which the data was collected in the first place. But,
if you've got a 5-year partnership between an institution and a project, can you get like one ethics approval for a whole bunch of stuff underneath it, or you have to get, or do you have to get ethics approval each time?
In the case of our institution, those typically go for 3 years, and so what happens in that process is that if something is added onto it, or if there is a significant change, then you can put in an amendment. But if you're trying to do something, I had this, as the ethics person from my school, the School of Geography, I had this problem yesterday where somebody had already been given ethics approval to do something, and then they wanted to do something else, and the ethics committee said, no, you can't do that under the original handling of the project that you suggested. But in a more general sense, we sort of get a bit of a coverall for, and you can imagine, for example, a PhD student, they'll be collecting data throughout this process, so it can't just be a 6-month clearance kind of thing. So there's some scope there.
Sorry, just jump in. Kate, I'm also a consultant, but have a fortunate or unfortunate degree of familiarity with university bureaucracy and ethics systems. I've worked in the academic space for many years. I think the other challenge with a lot of the ethics processes, remembering that it's a university's interpretation of ethics as opposed to ethical treatment of participants or participants' information. I think one of the other challenges is that it tends to be attached to particular methodologies or particular research questions. So in that sense, if you were looking to pilot a kind of student placement program for 5 years, but students were coming from different disciplines or focusing on different methodologies or different research questions, you're potentially looking at a project-by-project ethics application, which adds a whole nother layer of complexity into the equation.
I got one. In a completely non-academic, because I really don't understand what you guys are doing. But I think it has to be seen. And I know I did work in a tertiary institution before. I think the UN and tertiary institutions are probably 2 of the most bureaucratic animals you can find. And from a completely non-academic perspective, and just from the development side and impact and doing the doing, I have to say that, we haven't landed here by mistake. So in terms of Andreas and
Doug and you and women, it was about finding the path of least resistance, really, in all cases, and finding where there is some sort of framework or a path that's already there, and using what's already there. So I don't know anything about ethics, but I didn't have to because, Andreas would make sure we don't even have to go there. Essentially. I don't, And it has to be said, for what it is, and having known it from the inside as well, and on the other side of, not from an NGO perspective, looking at you, and they are convoluted, right? And somehow this came together in a record speed, because you just have to find those places, and have to forget for a minute maybe that this is an academic kind of a project first. Yes, it's part of it, but we just have to kind of forget that a little bit, and actually end up where, the end product is there, it's in you and women, and it's in VSA or whatever. And then you just have to find a way, and there's always a way. And not asking questions is great. Like that. So it's not a mistake, but so there is something for that to go Priya. They find ways, They never had to go to New York or wherever it is. It's always done locally. So,
And there's appetite for this kind of partnership in the NGO space as well. So I was down at the MFAT Hui, my second day on the job, with the MFAT and all the NGOs that happen to negotiated partnerships with MFAT, and so there was people from VSA down there as well. I was talking to, I met lots of different people from, lots of the big NGOs in the country, and they were all very keen on, the idea of having postgrad students come and do some of their research that they need done, and having that combined with, with whatever the postgrad students are interested in. So I think there's definitely a lot of scope for it to,
And free.
Go forward. And free. Probably also a large part of the attraction.
Like speaking to that, I'm one of those NGOs I work with, Caritas, we have a negotiated partnership with MFAT. We use a number of PhD students and do some research up in places like Kiribati at the moment. The ethics thing is a
Isn't that was with the car crushing?
No.
That sounds cool. There was
okay, tell me more.
Down at the Hui, there was a person who was very excited about the first car crushing in Kiribati. Do you remember who that was? We were trying to talk about that the other day. Anyway, sorry.
From that one. Really just more nutrition and this sort of stuff sounds a bit boring. But the ethics thing is something that we've needed to look at our own NGO. We're a reasonable sized NGO, but we're not a World Vision or so we have to look at our own internal policies around that. But we're also attaching ourselves with the university or the supervisor of the students, because the ethics thing in this particular instance is quite important. And we hadn't really, a number of us have gone through academia yourselves with their own masters and so forth, but you haven't sort of taken the next step of saying, what does this mean then for your students working with our participant communities? Some of them are highly vulnerable, and so there's, we needed to take a step back and then go back to the universities and go, well, what's your, it should be a round table discussion, because we initially thought our own policies around that would be sufficient, but in many ways they weren't. So it's a great opportunity to allow, in one case, the PhD candidate to speak into it and offer some assistance, and then go back to the university and get some perspective there. Because we focus so hard on our own, within an organisation, who we put in front of these communities, but there was little analysis done over the students in the same way. Because in the organisation we have a lot of checking and so forth in terms of people like myself and who's appropriate that I'm in front of and working with. I wasn't at the WHO because I was working with some communities in Bangladesh at the time, and it was just unfortunate timing. But around that there's a lot of work, but probably less robust with some student work. So it's really been an interesting space for us to try and negotiate as well, because you're quite correct, there's some great budget implications. We've talked about money here so much in the session, but for us it's a negotiated partnership. We've never got enough money, so to do the work we would like to do, so having some students involved, and particularly in the research and assessments and evaluations even through the program is kind of critical. We've kind of budgeted for that they'll be kind of cheap compared to paying a consultant at full rates when this aspect is...
Don't worry, I think he's pointing at me.
I mean, you do need to use consultants sometimes as well, and we do that, but if there's some aspects of the research does not need a full consultant, and particularly in numeracy and so forth, doing some of the data gathering, but there are other costs involved with that. So, I'd say a number of negotiated partnership NGOs have budgeted for that as well, for using those kind of resources beyond paying airfares and some accommodation. So it's I'm really enjoying the conversation. It's an interesting space to be in to provide opportunities for all involved. Both the students and for us as NGOs.
I think your point about the kind of positionality of the student is really important as well. Like Pri, you were talking about the possibility of students coming over and being part of the data gathering, but I guess we also need to think about, are they the right people to be doing that data gathering? We wouldn't have the language skills, and we wouldn't have the is a white foreigner coming in and asking questions, is that the right way to be doing the data gathering? So that's also those kind of concerns need to come into it.
And I think at the end of the day, there's always going to be limitations to what projects that can be done in this kind of format. So I think it's about finding those projects where you can maybe dodge some ethics questions, you can utilize that free resource and kind of all the stuff that we've kind of touched on. You can bring that all together and find the projects that would work in this kind of space. And like Priya said, like I imagine VSA have come to realise it is still really valuable, even if it is slightly limited on what you can achieve. And obviously from a student perspective, we loved it. So.
This is probably a question more for the university partners, I guess. Given that there is such a clear appetite from other actors for this kind of work, and obviously VSA are heavily invested in this space, but noting some of the bureaucratic hurdles that have been mentioned in the university sector, I think it's fabulous to hear about the success of projects like this and experiences, but I think it's also really interesting to think about how we share some of the bureaucratic lessons to try and expand this work in other sectors, and often those kind of tips and tricks about how to navigate the ethics processes or what templates and documents and resources were useful tend to be more closely guarded secrets by university institutions. So I was just wondering if there'd been kind of any attention paid to ways of sharing some of that kind of less exciting bureaucratic learning with the hope of expanding opportunities like this further.
Occasionally talk over a beer.
Yeah. I guess one thing to say is that I imagine that the ethics application between Massey, and Otago, etc., there's probably some differences. So it's not like a template kind of thing. When we do this again at Otago, I think that I will not put students through the learning process of understanding what goes into that ethics application to the same extent. I'll basically create the ethics application and then say, please read this, tweak it if you want to, but there's limitations to that as well, because then in doing so I'm essentially imposing the shape of the project on the students, and I don't want to do that. Part of the process of learning is to say, how do you understand this process and how do you want to get out of it, etc. So I think it's a really tricky thing. The other thing, again, some reflection from the other universities would be worthwhile, I guess, but we have a two-tiered ethics application process at Otago. So if you are doing Zoom interviews with people, or you're just using secondary data, etc., then that's what's called an ethics B. And so that's essentially an internal sign-off of the ethics application, and that's why that could get fast-tracked in the way that it did. Whereas if you're going to Fiji and working with market vendors, etc., that's an ethics A, that has to go through a central committee, they always come back with complaints, modifications, etc. So that's a couple of months basically that you're going into that process if you want to get that ethics. So I'm not sure whether you want to talk about it in the same way. It's not simple.
The other complication once you start going in the country is research visa process.
Yeah.
How many colleagues over there may or may not be aware of that research
I mean, one aspect that hasn't been mentioned and that refers more to the kind of actual volunteering programs is that the University of Auckland is very risk averse, and that's why it has only been the School of Social Sciences that has an agreement with BSA. And we try to get the university to sign the agreement, but the university thinks that those students are actually still students within our university when we do an assignment, while we have argued for the Univol program, students actually once they go for the 10-month assignment, they are not part of the university anymore. So the university has no liability whatsoever. But for the e-volunteering, it's a totally different thing. But again, in terms of ethics, I argue our students have a contract with BSA and UN Women, and it's not my responsibility to interfere with like where the data comes from and things like that, as long as students don't need to do their own interviews with human participants, right? So that's kind of clear from my perspective. I know it can be a little bit of a gray zone. Like if UN Women would say you have to interview a few people in addition to the secondary data that we will make available. But then again, I would still say that's between UN Women and the students. It's not between UN Women and the university.
And they were told also where to put the data and how to use it and where not to put it. Remember that conversation where someone said, oh yeah, we'll just put it on Facebook and they said, no, you won't.
No one said they would put it on Facebook. That's Facebook Messenger.
No, that's fine. So, you know.
If I may, I wanted to throw in one more aspect, and that's the international students. So far, the program is only open to domestic students. That's one reason why we don't offer this as a course, because I feel like it's not appropriate to say this is a course that we offer, but it's only for domestic students. International students can't enroll in this course. We have an internship course which is open to all students, but we have paused that one for a while. And if we would like to kind of re-establish it, we would have to have a guarantee that it's also open for international students. And because we have several NGOs here, would that mean then, because BSA, I don't know whether you can change
For us,
the rules?
it's a conversation with INFAT, but
Yes.
I don't think it's a hard one. If you are e-volunteer, it's probably a harder one if you want to send people in country. As an e-volunteer, I don't think it's a hard sell.
The problem is Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, you know, if anything happens when a person's in country, they then have to take it, you know, they have the responsibility to
I understand that, but then
But as e-volunteers, it should
if we could offer them the e-volunteering opportunity to international students, that would be a huge step.
Yeah, we just talked about it actually 2 days ago.
Yeah.
But, so yeah, I think it's probably doable, and we can find ways around it because their actual, so INFAT's liability in this case is like that, you know, they have not really.
Yeah.
So.
But INFAT still gives scholarships to students to come to New Zealand and then go back to their own
Different
country
buckets.
to do research.
Yeah, that's
Why can't we allow them to go to the third
lots of
country? It
things.
should be so much more enriching than going back to your home country.
Absolutely.
I mean, as
Well,
domestic students, they can go anywhere they like.
We do work with scholars that go back to their own country and become volunteers there, but that's another.
Right.
Yeah, Timor-Leste, we have a pilot project where we did have scholars that went back to Timor-Leste that were, from Timor-Leste.
Yeah.
And during COVID, we got them local volunteering roles. It was another way of trying to find some flexibility during COVID. So that pilot, we're early next year, going to be doing the final round of monitoring and evaluation on that, and then that information will go back to INFAC. So yeah, we're looking at lots of different models.
Yeah. Because we had a Colombian student who we brought to Fiji, and he was super popular in the community. People loved him, and they thought it was much more exotic than seeing those.
When I was going through deciding to do the study, because I had access to me quite a lot of data. The business that wanted me to design their project gave me everything they had, and when I thought about doing a study, then if it felt to be accepted at university, I was thinking it would be a model for VSA, like I'm accepted to do this study with this data, and then VSA pays my VSA salary. That means I am a student doing what a VSA job that could have been done, because about 3 years ago or so, we were able to go, and if we saw a need in the island that we could be filling as volunteers, then that could be arranged between VSA and people in the island. And the model I was thinking about, I'm registering, I am signing in as a PhD student. VSA pays the VSA scholarship as the normal VSA allowance, doing VSA thing, and yet that's for my research, because the data that I had was invaluable. It was just whole data required from this. So then the ethics will be taken care of by the university, and there's a soft relationship between VSA and the student. So I can feed the report to VSA, get the work done on the ground, and everything is quite good. So if you can look in a few handful of group like doing work in that model, then that might work.
Just a quick kind of comment around the process of research. I guess getting ethics, I think from maybe a learning student perspective, I think that's a really important journey to go on, is to actually understand why we have ethics, even though we're students. And also, previous to me doing my degree here down at Otago, I was working in government and did a bit of quite a lot of engagement with the ethnic communities, and a lot of, I think there's various levels of, skills in terms of engaging with people who are culturally and linguistically diverse, for example, and I think as students it's a really important experience to have really early on before you go on that professional journey, because regardless of whether you're in development sector, policy, and even the government, for example, they're coming up with frameworks for engagement, and actually that's all kind of connected. It's a really fundamental skill for whatever career you're wanting to do. But I think it comes to that kind of ethical question as well, as as students, that research relationship is not an equal power relationship. And I think one of the issues is what happens to the data and the insights after we've gotten them, because then there's obviously a feedback loop, right? And you need to honour the time and the insights that you've gathered. And I think that learning is really important to go through as part of the process. So while I think, it is really difficult with bureaucracy, and there's obviously a balance between what's feasible and what's desirable, that I found that process really valuable, is just sort of thinking actually a bit more deeply. You know, we were only talking with former VSA volunteers, so that was actually quite different because they were all really experienced. They were like, you know, really late in career, and so that was a really different experience, though, to had we spoken to maybe host organisations. And so I think while it is a difficult component to build in, if there is an opportunity, I do think it is worth students undergoing that kind of ethical reflection.
I think it can be quite good for NGOs as well. I mean, the other side of things is, yes, I mean, going through ethics, you know, it does take a long time to go through ethics committees through universities, and it's quite a process. But NGOs generally don't have access to that kind of a form. They don't have access to that rigorous sort of way of looking at things. And so, and obviously some of us at NGOs have been around a while. It's a while since we learned all the newest techniques and what's, the newest practice. So in some ways, having access to being able to go through that process of ethics review is kind of a nice refresher. And the only way that universities can have that sort of external way of knowing, okay, we are doing things the right way, which is, it can sometimes be useful. Otherwise, because otherwise you're just talking to each other within the NGO and reaffirming, oh yeah, we're doing it right, yeah.
Okay, any other comments, questions? Sacha?
Good question. So my question is around the partnership and how it works. So I'm from Massey and I teach into engineering, and so we have partnerships with industry organisations and students do projects. But one of the challenges we have is around expectations. The students expect far too much of the organisation, or the organisation expects too much from the students, or the key contact leaves the organisation and the students are left on their own. Is there a secret to getting this working well, or is it, to me it sounds like it's personal relationships between individuals?
There's a few people missing, actually, in this room to make that work, relationship-wise, because there's also Johannes and Myri.
Yeah, I think it's
all that team.
I think having VSA as kind of that middle ground was really helpful, because they have a lot of experience with students and all their expectations, and kind of tempering us and saying, okay, well look, I think this might work, this might not work, and then helping us engage in a dialogue with Priya's team, and kind of having, I think, kind of almost like a meeting zero where we sat down and we said, okay, look, this is what we want, this is what, from their perspective, what we expect, what knowledge products we want out of this, and kind of us asking the classic student questions. Oh, how many pages do you want? What format do you want? That kind of thing, and kind of making those two kind of worlds mesh together. Having VSA as that middle ground was really helpful, but also
sort of like a mentor relationship.
A little bit, yeah. I'd definitely say, I don't know from VSA's perspective they say they were mentors, but we felt like they were, and they gave us a lot of really good advice. But I think Brendan will agree with me, that first session where we sat down and said, what exactly are we after? Because we have this, okay, we'd like a report, we'd like have some data, this is what we want to do, but actually really getting to the nitty gritty. And I think with students you kind of have to go as in depth as possible, because that's what we expect when we have an assignment or an essay or something like that.
But I think Andreas also played a big role in that first meeting. So Andreas knew what we needed from the student perspective, and so he asked some really, really important questions that gave us the kind of structure that we needed. So it was really important that we had the university input in that meeting as well. But
that was my only input. All the rest was done by them.
But also, from that initial meeting, it was just us directly liaising with UN Women. And so our main focal point was Eliesa, the M&E lead, and we were just very lucky that he was very engaged and very responsive, and really encouraging and really positive about the relationship, and really appreciative. It was just really nice to have that attitude from his end. And unfortunately, he did leave in the middle of the project. But actually, it was after the really important first part where we had got all the information from him and kind of done the survey feedback that he had asked for us. So luckily it wasn't in the middle of the really vital first part of the project. Yeah, we were lucky to have him as our point person because he was right in that role.
And reflecting on one of the other projects that Sarah targeted, which was about localisation. So there was an attempt to try and reach out to a whole bunch of different organisations from the City Network, and Caritas responded, and some others didn't. And then there's a whole bunch of, literally hundreds of organisations that didn't. And this is nobody's fault. We all know that NGOs don't have the time, resources and bandwidth to then go and do all of these types of things. But I think that there's a lesson there from my end of things about trying to create those relationships, which is just, okay, we're just working with a single partner on this, rather than let's look at a thematic area and trying to bring in a whole bunch of different organisations to contribute to this, because in that particular instance, there just wasn't the buy-in from the external community to be able to really do something really in depth, and that was a really difficult situation for those students because they were basically invested in trying to do this research, and the ability for them to do that was kind of constrained by the amount of qualitative data that they were able to generate from all of this. So I think you're right. I think it's those partnerships and those relationships which really is the thing that we have to sort of focus on going forward.
Something we haven't really touched on, I think, today, and it's related to what you're saying there, is for us anyway, that the NGO I'm with is those partnerships and relationships and how they are currently opening some doors to using students from universities within the country. So USP, for example, if you're going to, also Delhi University in Timor-Leste where I work. And that's another, in terms of ethics, it's not a whole other kettle of fish again, and so we've been doing it very slowly and carefully, but again, under COVID, where we couldn't travel when we were having to use local resources more, it's reignited the conversation around using resources from universities within the countries that we have partners representing, and it's difficult to, and not necessary, perhaps for someone like myself to fly in and out. And it's part of the whole localisation agenda that has bubbled to the surface a lot in the last few years, but it does require some different ways of thinking and some different relationships, and even some types between universities in New Zealand and countries that work in to try and open those doors and see those relationships might lie, because it's got to be done quite carefully, but you cut across the issue of certain aspects of personality with language and cultural understanding and so forth, because if you're from that local community, then you've already ticked that box, so to speak. So that's just another thing that we're looking at the moment, and I think there's a huge opportunity there as well. There's some amazing universities in places where we work that I would be honest and I didn't realise that there's a huge resource there as well. It's then finding how to link into those universities. That's a long-term project.
We're almost out of time. Do you want to wrap things up?
Thank you all for attending, and I think it was a real Talanoa style discussion where everyone had meaningful contributions and you challenged us with some of your questions and contributed through giving your thoughts on the whole process. I like this discussion around ethics as well, and I think going forward, how do we move into a new situation where we can travel again, but how can we do this e-volunteering, like move it from a bit of a crisis management type of thing, where we just did it because there was no other way, making it a part of the portfolio of opportunities that we can offer to students, because I think it's valuable. And as Priya mentioned, having those e-volunteering assignments combined with one or two shorter trips to visit, as Brenda was able to do as part of her holiday. Those are things that we can possibly institutionalize, that at least one member of the team, for example, flies over and engages personally with the organization. I think that would be helpful. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to new models of engagement. I got a lot from some of the comments where it's said there's a lot of research interest in some of the organizations, the NGOs, that actually don't have the time to do their own research, and where new partnerships with universities might be really useful. Bringing in international students through in some ways, I think would be really useful. Not just to kind of bring in different faces as well, but also new ideas. And I always appreciate the kind of bringing in international students that don't just go back to their home country, but go to a third country, and we can have an opportunity as well. It brings new perspectives to a project as well. So yeah, thank you so much for coming, and I hope you all enjoyed this session, and see you all around and enjoy the lunch.